Friday the 13th, Part 4, the fan novelization by Landon Turner. Chapter 4. Samantha opened the door to the bedroom at the end of the hall and grinned at the side of the queen-size bed. "Looks like Paul and I are going to be having a lot of fun here for the next few days." Samantha laughed mischievously and turned back to Sarah, who stood in the doorway smiling weakly. Sam threw her luggage onto the mattress, unzipped it, and took out a large vanity purse and headed for the bathroom. "I need to freshen up," she said, taking out her ponytail and letting her jet-black hair fall down on her shoulders. Sarah sighed and followed her into the bathroom, leaning on the doorframe. Sam noticed Sarah's subtle uneasiness in the mirror. "Hey, what's the matter with you?" Sam asked, taking out a brush and combing it through her long silky hair. Sarah sighed. "I don't know how you do it," Sarah said. "Do what?" "You know," Sarah said, gesturing to the bed. Sam laughed. "Have sex? I don't know how you don't." "You do it with everybody," Sarah said, more to herself. "I do not," Sam protested, spraying a dab of perfume down her cleavage. "I do it with Paul." "Really?" Sarah said, skeptical. Sarah had heard all the rumors at school about Sam's sexual escapades. She worried about her sometimes. What if she got a disease from some guy? What if she got pregnant? She would never forgive herself if she let her best friend ruin her life because she didn't say anything about her many lovers and sexual happenings. "Come on, Sarah. You know how guys are. They lie about that all the time. They say that about every girl." "They don't say anything about me," Sarah said. "That's because you don't have a reputation," Sam replied. "I mean, you and Doug have been dating for months, and you've barely kissed him." "I have too," Sarah said indignantly. "Look, Sarah, I got my reputation in the 6th grade. Don't you think it's time you and Doug—" Sam gave Sarah a knowing look. "I don't know," Sarah said, clearly uncomfortable about the subject. "I mean, what does Paul think about you having sex with a bunch of guys?" Sarah asked. "Hey, Paul thinks I'm great in bed, so that's where I keep him. Seriously, though, you should try it. It's a lot of fun. Burns calories, too," Samantha said. Sarah sighed again, just wanting to change the subject. "So, what are the sleeping arrangements?" "Well, Paul and I are taking this room, and you and Doug can take the room next door," Samantha said, applying some bright red lipstick. She noticed Sarah's displeased expression. "Don't worry, they're bunk beds." Samantha rubbed her lips together and turned to Sarah. "Hey, I don't mean to pressure you. If you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it. Sex is like skydiving. It can be scary at first, and you have to jump without thinking about it. Once you're in, you can't go back, but it's amazing," Samantha explained, leaning against the bathroom counter. Sarah smiled. "Thanks. I just don't think Doug would want to do it with a girl like me." "Oh, please. He really likes you. I see him look at you the way Paul looks at me. Trust me, he's a guy. He wants it bad." "You think so?" Sarah's face began to feel hot, and she blushed. "Yep, he definitely does. But just let loose and have some fun this weekend, and don't worry about the sex stuff. If you aren't ready, then you aren't ready." She was right, Sarah thought to herself. She would have the time of her life out here. Her and Doug could finally get to have some alone time, and it wouldn't necessarily involve fucking. They could sit on the shore of the lake and talk or go for a hike. It was going to be an amazing weekend, and she needed to stop worrying so much. After all, what was there to worry about? Sex was a lot simpler than people often made it out to be. With anything, there are risks involved, and you should understand those risks and take some responsibility for your actions. Girls like Sam didn't really do that, but who was Sarah to judge? After all, Sam had a lot of sex, but it was at least with Paul and Paul only. She wasn't a homewrecker. There are a lot worse things you can be than someone who enjoys frequent sex, even casual sex. Sarah hated the stigma against it. Maybe her subconscious mind was somehow buying into it. Maybe that's why she hadn't let Doug go there with her. Maybe it was because they just weren't right for each other. But she knew that wasn't it either. Doug was one of the sweetest people she had ever met. It had to be him. If she was going to do it this weekend, it had to be him. It was now or never, she thought. They would be graduating soon, and she didn't want Doug to be the one that got away. Life was too short to not take too many chances. Life was far too short. Mrs. Jarvis took a long, slow sip of her tea, staring out the window at the rental house. All of the lights were on, and she could hear faint music coming from within. There was no telling what they were all doing in there, Mrs. Jarvis thought to herself. But they are just kids. She did some wild things growing up herself, or at least things that were considered wild in her time. "How long are you going to keep spying on those kids?" Trish asked, curled up on the sofa with a book. Mrs. Jarvis chuckled. "I just hope we're going to be able to get some sleep with them partying all night long." "Surely they can't stay up much longer," Trish said. Mrs. Jarvis crossed the room and sat in the armchair. "Well, I think I'm going to hit the sack," Trish said, standing and heading for the staircase. "Good night, sweetie," Mrs. Jarvis said. Trish leaned down to hug her. "Are we still on for tomorrow morning?" "Yep, once around the lake," Trish replied. "All right, check on Tommy and make sure he's in bed. Good night," Mrs. Jarvis said as Trish disappeared up the staircase. Mrs. Jarvis shifted position in the armchair, looking down at the remote on the coffee table. Should she watch the news? She'd just end up spooking herself out of her mind, and Tommy and Trish usually could tell when something was bothering her. Then she'd have to tell them all about the murders, and she didn't want Tommy to be upset. Last time he was scared about something, he would come in around 2 in the morning and want to sleep with her in bed, and she never got a wink of sleep those nights. She thought twice and picked up a magazine, leafing through it. Jason was watching her every move as she yawned, tossed the magazine onto the table, stood up, and headed for the staircase. "Tommy, are you brushing your teeth?" Mrs. Jarvis called, rapping on the bathroom door. "Yes," she heard Tommy reply through a mouthful of toothpaste. "Okay, I'm going to come tuck you in a few minutes," she said, and walked down the hallway to her bedroom. Tommy spit into the sink, rinsed with a glass of water, and turned off the faucet. He walked out of the bathroom and into his room at the end of the hallway. Tommy's bedroom looked like every sci-fi aficionado's dream. Sci-fi and horror movie posters plastered all over the walls, a few high-tech game consoles next to a computer monitor and processing system on a sturdy desk, action figures lined up in rows on shelves, and about a dozen rubber masks hanging from the ceiling, and about a dozen more displayed on a large wooden bookcase by the door. Tommy crossed the room to his bed, and as he climbed in and started to lay his head on the pillow, he caught a glimpse out the open bedroom window. A smile crept across his face as he realized he could see across the yard into the upstairs bedroom of the rental home. It was the tall, slender brunette of the group, and she was standing in front of a mirror brushing her long hair. Tommy felt his heart racing 100 miles a minute, and his hands began to feel clammy. He moved closer to the window, and he cackled with excitement as the girl pulled off her shirt. What was happening? What was so exciting about this? It was just a girl. That was the thing. It was a girl, and for some reason, not comprehensible to his 12-year-old mind, he was in love. He watched for about a minute, biting his nails in anticipation. Sam was with her, back to the window, watching the door as Paul walked in and they began to kiss. Tommy giggled impishly, struggling to control himself as the adrenaline and other hormones pumped through his system, and blood began to rush to his head and his extremities. He kept watching in silent fascination as Paul reached behind Sam's back and slowly undone her bra. It fell to the ground. Tommy thrashed around in pure delight, kicking his legs up in the air as if he were a wind-up toy, and someone had just wound him up and let him fly. He bounced up and down on the bed with joy and turned back to the window, his eyes wide. Then he heard his mother's footsteps down the hall. In a split second, Tommy dove down onto the bed in the sleeping position and began to make his best fake snoring sound. The bedroom door opened, and Mrs. Jarvis crossed the room to the bed, where Tommy was curled up under his covers, his eyes tightly shut. She smiled and leaned down to kiss his forehead. She gently tousled his hair and turned to leave when she saw the cracked window. She went to close it, saw the view, and gasped. Mrs. Jarvis glanced back at Tommy, who was still snoring loud as ever with his eyes shut tight, and she shook her head, chuckling to herself. She sighed, closed the window, and shut the curtains. Nice try, Tommy, she thought to herself. She decided to give him the benefit of the doubt that he hadn't been spying on those kids, and just left it alone. After all, she had been spying herself. She admittedly was anxious about all those teenagers. They'd probably be drinking, smoking, having their trash and beer bottles in the yard, and have the whole woods be smelling like dope the next few days. But hey, maybe they were good kids. Maybe Tommy could make some friends and stop being shut in his room making those scary masks, and Trish could meet some friends or maybe a boy. That thought made her even more anxious. It was hard for her to talk about those kinds of things with Trish, but at least she was a girl, and Mrs. Jarvis knew about women. But she didn't know what to say to Tommy, and she didn't feel like admonishing him now. How could she blame him for being curious at that age? Mrs. Jarvis headed for the door, turned out the lights, and left, closing the door behind her. Tommy opened one eye to make sure that she was gone, and sat up quickly in bed looking at the blocked view with disappointment. What was that girl's name again? The one with the black hair that fell around her shoulders. The one with the huge, chest. Sam, Tommy thought. That's her name, Sam. Tommy laid back down and shut his eyes, repeating her name over and over in his mind until he fell asleep. So where is this Crystal Point? Sarah asked, sitting down on the couch beside Doug. My buddy told me all about it. You just take the trail around the lake and it's about half a mile, Paul said, kissing Sam on the neck, who was curled up in his lap in the armchair. The rental house had a bungalow vibe. The main room had 2 sofas and an armchair facing a television set back in a polished mahogany cabinet, a grand piano, and a dozen paintings and knickknacks. The decor gave it a domestic feel, but it was obvious they were just placed there to make it feel like you weren't just staying in a rental and to allow you to suspend reality for at least a little while. In the corner was a turntable with stacks of vintage records adjacent to either side. The main room was divided into an apartment-sized kitchen complete with old-timey pots and pans, racks, and a dining room. It's supposed to be a lot of fun, Paul continued. He said there's an old tire swing, but he wasn't sure if it was there anymore. Wait, are we swimming? I didn't bring my bathing suit, Samantha said. You know what that means, Paul grinned, deviously nuzzling Sam's neck. Skinny dip! Samantha giggled flirtatiously, but stopped when she saw Sarah's eyes grow wide. Don't you think we shouldn't be skinny dipping when there's a family right next door? Sam said, swatting at Paul. They can join in, Paul said, guffawing. Sam rolled her eyes as he kissed her neck playfully. Ted was sitting at the table playing a handheld video game when Jimmy walked into the kitchen, heading to the refrigerator. Have you called Betty? Ted asked. No, Ted, Jimmy sighed with exasperation, grabbing a beer from the bottom shelf. Come on, Jimmy, man, you gotta try to get her back. No, Ted, you know what, I don't, Jimmy retorted, moving towards the table. I've come to realize that you can have a good time without girls. Ted looked up from his game and wagged his finger like a scolding mother. That's a sin, you dead fuck. Jimmy pushed his finger away. I really don't want you to call me that anymore. Ted stood up and playfully punched Jimmy in the stomach. Oh, come on, Jimbo. Can't take a joke? He patted him on the shoulder. The computer don't lie. There is no computer, Jim said. Ted grinned, shaking his head. Jim groaned. And there's no Betty either. Back in the main room, a fire crackled softly in the fireplace, and Paul took a poker and moved the logs around gently. He sat back in the armchair, cuddled up next to Sam. That family seemed nice, Doug said, putting his arm around Sarah. Yeah, that Trish girl was kind of hot, Paul remarked. Sam punched him in the arm. Hey, she exclaimed. What? I wouldn't mind her coming down to hang out with us, that's all. Maybe we can see if she wants to come with us to the lake tomorrow morning, Sarah chimed in, toying with a strand of her hair. We can invite her mother, won't that be nice? Paul joked. Sam hit him again. You're such a pig, she said. Sarah began to think about the idea of all of them skinny dipping. Maybe she could just sit on the dock and read a book or something, but she didn't want to be the only one not joining in. It wasn't that she was insecure about her body, or maybe it was. She had stared at her naked body in the mirror long and hard on several occasions, just to see if she was sexy or not. She really didn't have anything to compare it to, but she thought she looked okay. Only Doug had never seen it before. What if he didn't like it? What if Sam looked better than her? Surely Doug wasn't that shallow. But isn't that how all guys are? All they care about is how a girl looks? Hopefully Doug didn't find the idea too inviting either, and the two of them could go for a walk. She didn't know what she'd do if they all saw her naked. She hardly knew Paul, Jimmy, or Ted. She could completely freak out if anyone saw her so vulnerable like that. She just might die if that happened. She just might die. stranger in the woods. It was the start of another early morning at Crystal Lake. Mrs. Jarvis and Trish had already gone on their morning jog on the path around the lake. The birds were singing and the sun was shining its pale yellow gleam down through the canopy, casting shadows on the path. The night had left traces of it all over in dewdrops on the ground, and the moon was barely visible behind the thin, wispy clouds. The 6 teenagers came to a fork in the trail and stopped. "Great! Which do we take?" Samantha asked Paul, her eyes wide with worry. Paul scanned the map he held out in front of him. If I'm reading it right, we take the left," Paul said. He pointed his finger dramatically like an explorer, and the group laughed. They all embarked down the trail, listening to the morning birds singing in the trees and swatting at mosquitoes that were just beginning to come out and feel comfortable in the heat of the day. They were all showered and changed into more comfortable clothes, dressed for an afternoon on the lake shore. The air was just at the right temperature to go swimming, and they had all been stoked to have their little area of the lake all to themselves to do whatever they wanted without anyone watching. Sam and Paul led the way, with Sarah and Doug not far behind. Jimmy and Ted were the last of the group. Ted had a pair of expensive black headphones on. They were hooked up to an expensive new Walkman. "Hey, Ted," Jimmy said, his hands in his pocket. "Hey, Ted," he said louder, Ted's music drowning out Jimmy's voice. Ted still didn't hear him, and Jimmy started saying what was on his mind anyway. "Ted, I think you're right. I think I'm going to give Betty a call when we get into town." No, calling Betty is definitely a dead fuck thing to do," Ted said, forgetting his music was at the current volume that it was. His voice sounded abnormally louder as a result, and the group turned to stare at him awkwardly. Ted made a dumb face and then pulled off his headphones as the group continued walking down the trail. "You wanted me to call her," Jimmy said. "Sometimes a Ted Meister is wrong, Jimbo. I've been thinking. The first rule of love is never get rejected by the same girl twice. That's useless," Ted explained as Jimmy tried to take him seriously. "You want to make a fool of yourself? Do it with someone new." "I don't know anyone new," Jimmy protested. "Well, sex is a great way to meet them," Ted said, and plugged his headphones back in. Just then they all heard the spinning of wheels coming down the trail behind them, and high-pitched laughing. They all whirled around except Ted, whose head was bobbing to the music coming through his headphones. Jimmy's eyes grew wide, and he spun Ted around, whose jaw dropped, and he let his headphones fall and dangle from his pocket. 2 girls on bicycles came careening down to the trail, and as they saw the 6 teens, they came to a stop and both hopped off their vehicles. "Wow," Jimmy muttered, more to himself than anyone. Was he seeing double? No. There were 2 of them, and they looked exactly alike. Twins. And they were drop-dead gorgeous. Long, slender legs accentuated by tight spandex running shorts. Their ample chests visible through a tank top and a sports bra, and long chestnut hair falling around their shoulders. "Sorry," one of the girls said. "We almost ran into you guys." "Oh, that's okay," Paul said, cutting through the group and extending his hand. "I'm Paul." He shook both of their hands as they smiled. Sam caught the one on the left winking at him and scowled. "Ted, nice to meet ya," Ted introduced himself. Jimmy just stood there in awe, his mouth watering. "Hi, I'm Tina and this is Terry," the girl on the left said with the pearly white smile. The girl on the right waved. Terry was slightly taller than Tina, with darker, slightly longer hair. Still, it was nearly impossible to tell them apart. But none of the guys in the group seemed to care. You girls live around here?" Jimmy stuttered nervously. They both nodded. "How much further is Crystal Point?" "Hey," Paul asked. "That's where we're going," Tina said. "Yeah, it's a long walk from here," Terry said. "We can take it," Ted said, flashing his millionaire smile. "You want to join us?" Paul asked. The twins looked at each other and smiled. "Sure," they said in unison. "Lead the way," Paul said, ushering them to the front. Jimmy felt his knees buckling. "Twins," he said to Ted, who nodded in agreement, both of their eyes wide and grinning ear to ear. 2 of them. "Yep, and 2 for us." They followed the group eagerly, but Sarah stayed behind, pulling Doug off to the side. "I think I'm going to head back to the car," she said. "Are you sure?" Doug asked. "Yeah, I think I forgot something. I'll meet you guys there," she said, and walked off down the trail. She was sure she left her book that she had planned to read lying on the seat, and she needed something to do down at the lake. God, they were going to be skinny dipping, and she just knew that Sam was going to try to make her jump in. She felt the nervous pit in her gut as she strolled down the trail to the car. Of course, all she had to do was just say no. She didn't feel like swimming anyway. Just tell them your stomach was upset. All she wanted to do was sit on the shore and relax in the summer weather and sunbathe. She didn't care that the others were skinny dipping, but she didn't want to do it. She didn't have to. There were people she didn't know, and they just invited some random strangers to swim with them. No way was she taking her clothes off in front of the Doublemint twins. It just wasn't going to happen. Suddenly she stopped. A twig snapped. Somewhere in the woods on either side of her she turned, slowing down and trying to listen. It was probably just a squirrel. She shot another wary glance at the winding trail behind her and kept walking. There! She heard it again. A rustle in the bushes. She turned again to look behind her and scan the dense underbrush. Someone was there. It was probably just Sam trying to scare her like she always did, or maybe Ted joking around. She stood for a moment, slowly backing away down the trail as she listened, but the woods were all quiet except for the chirping of birds in the trees. Suddenly there was a sharp throbbing pain in her side, and she cried out as she felt the splintered end of the tree branch jam into her rib cage. She spun around and saw what she had backed into, the broken end of a log protruding onto the path. She had backed right into it. She laughed sheepishly. What was wrong with her? Why was she letting the skinny dipping thing get to her? And the sex thing? Worrying about all this is making you go crazy, she told herself. Just relax. Don't do anything you aren't comfortable with doing. It's as simple as that. God, she thought, she could have backed off a cliff or fell off the trail somehow and hurt herself, all because she was hearing noises in the woods. Maybe it was because it was Friday the 13th tomorrow. She remembered what Sam had said on the way up. Friday the 13th. Looks like it won't be such bad luck after all, she had said. And she was starting to think Sam was wrong. Maybe there was something to this Friday the 13th thing, because this weekend was turning out to be a disaster. She didn't even know two of these people, and now there were two more random people, two gorgeous women, who could probably still dug away with one single glance, and now they were all going skinny dipping without her. To make matters worse, she was now almost getting herself impelled and getting nervous over nothing. She couldn't win. She would either have to strip and dip or feel lousy that she was missing out, and it was all her own fault. Why had her parents sheltered her? You couldn't do that to your kids because eventually they would see the real world for what it truly was and wouldn't know how to handle it. It would be too overwhelming. You have to expose them gradually and eventually let them experience the world fully and immerse themselves in it and learn from it. You couldn't shelter them or else you risk having a child that is behind all of his or her peers. And now here she was in that exact situation. She had always been the mature one in school, as called by her teachers, but she was starting to realize that it was actually just emotional repression. All of the kids who were acting out were actually dealing with their emotions. Maybe not in healthy ways, but they were still dealing with them. All she did was push her emotions down, and that made her seem quiet and mature. In reality, she just wasn't connecting with anyone. She was just observing silently in her own little world. Her parents hadn't made it any better. They supported the notion that it was bad to want to take risk and live a little dangerously sometimes. How could she blame them? They had also been sheltered. It was 1984 and the internet was just now barely starting to come into the picture, so it was a little easier to expose yourself to information. But in the 40s, when her parents grew up, it was probably that much harder. Low education and ignorance was probably rampant. All human beings want to live a little eventually. You couldn't hold them back for very long, or else they would have to break free or repress it until they hate themselves. This weekend had been a chance for her to live a little and leave all that shit behind her. But it was getting harder and harder to just let loose. Just calm down, she thought. Stop overthinking. Maybe she didn't have to take off her clothes to have a good time. These next few days could be fun and relaxing, and she just had to allow it to happen. Or else she was going to end up ruining everyone's mood by freaking out or scaring herself to death. What could go wrong? "Cannonball!" Paul yelled, pulling back on the tire swing and leaping on, jumping off and curling up his legs just as the tire started to swing back to the shore and landing in the water with a resounding splash. Crystal Point was a small sandy beach on the north side of the lake, marked by a huge boulder jutting out into the middle of the water. A weathered dock stuck out into the lake, and a few old canoes were resting on the shore. A makeshift tire swing hung from the gnarled branch of an oak tree that hung over the shallow part of the lake. Tina was next, leaping onto the tire swing and catapulting off into the water with a huge splash. Terry came after her, and then Sam, who both landed in the water as Paul held up imaginary signs, pretending to judge their dives. Sarah was lying on a towel on the dock beside Doug, and Jimmy and Ted were standing on the shore awkwardly, still in awe of the two gorgeous girls they now had at their disposal. "Come on in," Tina called to Ted and Jimmy. Jimmy laughed nervously. No thanks, we haven't got our suits." "Skinny dip!" Paul shouted as he reached down into the water, pulled off his trunks, and threw them onto the shore. Sam squealed with excitement and took off her bikini top and bottoms, tossing them onto the shore. Tina and Terry both did the same. "What the hell are we doing?" Ted said, his face lighting up with excitement. He threw off his shirt and pulled down his pants and shorts simultaneously, running towards the water bearing it all. Paul and Sam both cheered as Ted dove into the water head first. "Come on, Jim," Paul said. Jimmy couldn't believe he was about to do it. "Fuck it," he thought. He unbuttoned his shirt and pulled down his pants and shorts, tossed them into a pile beside a stump, and ran into the water. Doug looked at the group splashing and having a blast in the water and frowned. "Hey, I'm going to take a quick dip," he said. He didn't give Sarah time to reply. He cannonballed into the water and exchanged a high five with Paul. Sarah sighed and sat up on the dock, picking up the book she had brought and flipping to her bookmark. "Suit yourself," she said glumly. Samantha dog paddled through the murky water towards Sarah and raised the upper half of her body onto the dock. "Come on, Sarah, strip and dip," Sam urged. "No," Sarah said uneasily. "Sarah, let's see what you got. Come on." "Sam, I said no." "Fine, then I'm going to stay under until you do," Sam said mock angrily. She pinched her nose and disappeared under the surface of the water. Sarah turned away from her nonchalantly and shrugged. "Fine, see you later." It was another one of Sam's stupid ploys to get Sarah to do something she was completely uncomfortable with doing. After a minute or two of being underwater, she would realize that she couldn't hold her breath that long and would be forced to come back to the surface. She was just going to have to stay under there all day because there was no way she was taking her clothes off, especially not in front of all these people she didn't even know. It was just a matter of time before Sam would come up to the surface, groan in annoyance, and swim back to her friends. But 30 seconds had already passed, and then a minute. No sign of Sam, no splashing. Sarah turned around to the spot where Sam went under, and there was no sign of her. No bubbles were rising to the surface. She had disappeared. Sarah shook her head and laughed to herself. How much longer was she going to keep this up, Sarah thought. There was no way she could hold her breath for that long. Then another minute passed, and Sarah bit her lip nervously. She turned back towards the water and scanned the surface for Sam. She was nowhere to be seen. She checked both sides of the dock for her friend, but she was gone. Did she swim back to the group? No, she didn't. Sarah counted for everyone except for Sam. Was she still underwater? What if she got stuck? What if her foot got caught in something and she was running out of air? "Sam?" Sarah called, her eyes wide with worry. She couldn't hold her breath this long. Something was very wrong. "Sam! Sam!" Sarah screamed, beginning to panic. Just then, Sam's lifeless form came floating out from underneath the dock. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, and her tongue hung from the side of her mouth. "Oh my God," Sarah thought. "She's dead. Sam is dead." Just as Sarah began to lose her mind with terror, Samantha came to life and lunged out of the lake, grabbed Sarah by both of her shoulders, and pulled her off the pier into the water with a splash. Sam burst out laughing as Sarah thrashed around in the water. She finally regained her composure, finding her footing on the sandy bottom of the lake. She tossed her wet hair out of her eyes and splashed Sam angrily. "You bitch!" Sarah exclaimed as Samantha laughed hysterically. The anger didn't last long as Sarah began to laugh along with Sam, who splashed around with her, playfully. The teens continued laughing and splashing each other for the next half an hour, not once seeing the man standing in the shelter of the trees just a few yards down the shoreline, watching them, feeling the intense hatred for their youth and their carelessness burn brighter with every laugh, with every shout and cry. He felt it growing stronger. It was Friday the 13th, a new dawn on Crystal Lake, a new nightmare. The massacre at Crystal Lake wasn't over. It continued tonight. Tonight they would see what pain and suffering felt like. They would feel what the man in the tattered worksuit watching them had felt when he drowned in the very lake they were enjoying. They hadn't been watching him. They only wanted to satisfy their own filthy, loathsome needs. It was the same suffering he felt when he watched his own mother, the only one who ever cared about him enough to kill for him, be murdered by one of them. Repulsive teenagers who only sought physical pleasure and rescinded all other priorities. They had to be stopped. They all had to die before anyone else's life could be ruined, ripped from him in an instant. They would all get what's coming to them. What they stole from Jason, they would return with their lives. Jason gripped the knife tighter, the thought of the bloody atonement filling him with immeasurable satisfaction. They would learn why Friday the 13th at Crystal Lake was a day to be feared. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 4 of Friday the 13th 4, the final chapter, a fan novelization by Landon Turner. Landon, I'm really enjoying this. I think you did an amazing job on it. I hope everybody else is enjoying it as well. Please let me know in the comment section what you think of the book so far. Let Landon know how much you appreciate that he wrote this for us to enjoy. I'll be back very soon with more. Got some great stuff coming up this October. I'm going to be putting out the retro horror video game videos pretty soon, starting with Friday the 13th for the regular Nintendo. Also, on Slash Tracks, we're going to be riffing and watching Halloween Resurrection for our Halloween episode. So be sure to join us for that as we tear that horrible movie to pieces. But I'll be back very soon with more of this book. Very soon, and I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, and I'll see you soon.